Hello again, welcome back to another video. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the allowance method for estimating bad debts at the end of a period, except this time we're going to learn those other two methods that companies can use. So last video we talked about the percent of sales method. This video will kick off our discussion with the percent of receivables method. The biggest difference between the percent of receivables method and the aging of receivables method, these two kind of go hand in hand, versus the percent of sales method that we talked about last time, is the end result of your first formula that you use for your calculation. With the percent of sales method, when we multiplied the sales by the bad debt percentage, the number we got was our estimated bad debts expense. It was the number that we wanted to use for our journal entry, our adjusting entry that we made at the end of the period. So we took that number right down and we plugged it into the adjusting entry. With the percent of receivables and the aging of receivables, that's not true. With the percent of receivables and the aging of receivables, the number that we get when we work our way through these first initial formulas here is actually the desired balance of the allowance account. So that's why you could see here, step number 1 says determine the desired amount in allowance for bad debts. All right, we do that by multiplying our accounts receivable at the end of the period by a percentage that we expect not to collect. So when we're basing it on accounts receivable, one more time, the answer that we get in that initial formula, it's not our bad debts expense, it's what we want to have, our desired balance of the allowance for bad debts account. So we add that extra step to it then. In order to figure out bad debts expense, we have to do a little T account analysis. We have to look at the allowance for bad debts. We have to see if there's any balance in there already. And then what we need to do is adjust it for however much we need to get it to our result from step 1. All right, we need to make sure that the allowance for bad debts account equals what we wanted it to from step 1. You might be asking yourself, how could there already be a balance in allowance for bad debts? Well, remember, allowance for bad debts just represents an amount we thought we weren't going to get from that previous period, right? So if the amount that we actually didn't get in the next period wasn't exactly that amount, that means there's still a balance in the allowance account. That balance could be a debit balance. If it's a debit balance, that means we actually didn't collect more than what we said we weren't going to collect. Or it could still be sitting here with a credit balance, which just means that we thought we weren't going to collect a certain amount and we didn't collect some of it, but we actually didn't collect less than we estimated. All right, we'll talk about that next class when we talk about writing off a bad debt. All right, but just a heads up, that's how there could still be a balance in that account. All right, so let's see how this one works, this two-step process for the percent of receivables method. This is in your discussion guide, so if you want to grab that discussion guide, hit pause on the video and go ahead and grab it out real quick. All right, so for our percent of receivables example, it tells me here, Murray Company has accounts receivable totaling $25,000, an allowance for bad debts of $350, a credit balance. It says Murray estimates that 3% of accounts receivables are uncollectible. So it wants to know what is bad debts expense for 2018. Alright, so we'll kick it off the same way we did with the percent of receivables method, in that we'll just punch our numbers through our quick formula here. The only difference is, instead of multiplying sales by that percentage, we're going to multiply accounts receivable by that percentage. So accounts receivable of $25,000 multiplied by 3%, that tells us in step number 1 the desired balance of this allowance account, 25,000 times 3%, or $750. So what we're saying, one more time, is we want the allowance account to have a credit balance of $750. All right, well, if I go back to my problem info real quick right here, check out that allowance for bad debts account already, and you see that it already has a $350 credit balance. So if it's already got $350 in there, and I'm saying I wanted to have $750 in there, then the amount of the adjusting entry doesn't need to be for $750, right? It's going to be for less than that because it already has an established balance in that account. So to figure out what we need to adjust it for, the easiest thing to do is just plug it into your T account here. So if I look at this T account and it tells me that it started with $350 here, right? And it tells me that my desired balance is $750. All right, well, that tells me the adjusting entry that I need to make here is $400. And this shouldn't be accounts receivable. Sorry, that's a typo. This should be the allowance for bad debts T account. So the allowance for bad debts T account, if I'm just looking at this entry right here, I know it needed to be $750. That's what I just calculated. So to get to that 750, sorry, a little too quick on that one, I need it to be adjusted by $400. All right, so remember, the adjusting entry, like I told you, time and time again, the debit and the credit is always the same thing, just how we get to the numbers a little bit different. So I just calculated that the adjusting entry amount needs to be this $400 right here. One more time, the debit and credit, they're still the same. So I just debit bad debts expense for $400, and I credit allowance for bad debts for $400. And that's how I do the percent of receivables method under the allowance method. All right, so let's check out this last method then, the aging of accounts receivable method. The aging of accounts receivable method is almost identical to the percent of receivables method, in that we're really taking a percentage of our receivables. The only difference is we actually break down our receivables into different age classifications. So we'll say we have these receivables that aren't yet due. We have these other group of receivables that are 30 to 60 days past due. And then these other ones are 60 to 90 days past due. And then these other ones are even greater than that. They've been outstanding for more than 90 days. All right, so what we do then is we tie a separate percentage to each age classification. So the ones that aren't yet due, they're going to have the lowest percentage of uncollectability, because it's still a pretty good chance that we're going to collect them if they're not due yet. And then as those receivables get older, that percentage is going to increase. It's going to get higher and higher and higher, because the older that receivable gets, the less likely it is that we're ever going to see that money. So then all we do is we just compute a separate allowance for each age grouping. All right, so one more time, if you want to pull out your discussion guide. Your discussion guide includes this aging of accounts receivable example for Musicland. Go ahead and pause that video and pull it out. So it tells me here for Musicland at December 31st, 2018, it gives me 5 different age classifications of accounts receivable here. Not due, 1 to 30 days past due, so on and so forth, all the way down to over 90 days past due. So I have total receivables of $49,900. And then I have 2%, 5%, 10%, 25%, and 40% as my percentage of uncollectability, the chances that I'm not going to get that amount. So then all I have to do with this one, just like I did with the percent of receivables method, is I just multiply each receivable balance by its percentage. So the ones that aren't yet due, 37,000 times 2%, that tells me I'm not going to get about 740 of that amount. 6,500 times 5%, I'm not going to get estimate of 325 of that amount. 3,500 times 10%, I'm guessing I'm not going to get 350 of that balance. 1,900 times 25%, I'm not going to get about 475 of that amount. And then finally, the ones that are over 90 days, I'm saying I'm not going to get about 40% of that amount, I'm guessing, which tells me that's $400 I think I'm not going to collect. All right, so I multiply each accounts receivable by its percentage of uncollectability. Then what I want to do is I just want to total them up. So add these all together, 740, 325, 350, 475, and 400. That gives me now 2,290 as my total desired balance of that allowance for bad debts. All right, so this 2,290 is the total amount that I'm showing as uncollectible, or the total balance that I need in allowance for bad debts. All right, so I got to do the same thing that I did before. Let's assume this time for Musicland that allowance for bad debts already had a $200 credit balance in it. So if it already had a $200 credit balance and I want it to be 2,290, that means I need to adjust it for an additional $2,090 to make it get to that $2,290 balance. Adjusting entry, just like we said, it's always the same thing. A debit to bad debts expense and a credit to allowance for bad debts. So just to summarize one more time, the biggest difference between these two methods that we talked about here in this video, the percent of receivables and the aging of receivables, is really the first number that you're calculating. With these two methods, that number that we're calculating is not the number for our journal entry, remember, it's the number that we need to have in the allowance for bad debts account. So it adds that extra step. We have to do a little T-account analysis there, and we got to figure out how much do I need to adjust this account for to get it to that desired balance. All right, that's all 3 methods under the allowance method for estimating bad debts. When we come back to class on Monday, we'll go ahead and we'll continue this discussion of allowance method. We'll look at how we actually write off a bad debt, and then we'll move this discussion on to notes receivable next time. Alright guys, hopefully you enjoyed these videos. Have a spectacular weekend.